to jump right in. The purpose of this session was to give you a chance to preview what the survey data results are going to look like, and talk a little bit about how these surveys contributed to the results of our efficacy study. We're going to look at what they measure and why what they measure is important. And we're going to look at examples of individual school results. I will not be bringing your school results on the screen because we are very careful about the confidentiality of your results. So you have full control over with whom and how you share these results. That's not our choice, that's your choice. So the results you'll look at today are examples. And then we're just going to talk a little bit about interpreting that data. And I'm going to share with you an approach to using the data, both an inquiry approach and some general comments about what you can do with the data and some cautions about what you should avoid doing with the data. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at two instruments in particular. They are instruments that are validated with national samples. The studies that have validated these instruments have been conducted repeatedly. And so what you know is that these instruments are very reliable for and valid for measuring what they purport to measure. We also know that the characteristics of school-wide leadership conditions that these instruments measure are positively linked with student achievement. So why is that important? You can measure a lot of things, but what we're measuring with these instruments are both the work that we focused on for the Hill process and the school conditions that are important to support student success. So we're going to take a look at both of those measures, how they measure things that are very compatible and very related with each other, but also how they measure things that they produce a little bit different information about those things that matter. The other thing I wanted to just lift up here is that these two measures plus 4 others that are definitely good support for these measures, but they're sort of the secondary pieces, 3 of which you as principals filled out, all tell an important story. But actually they tell lots of important stories. They tell a story about how you all did as a cohort of 75 schools. They let us know if how you changed and grew compares positively to the way that the cohort B schools changed or grew during the same period of time. And that's because we have to have a controlled study that lets us know, are we making any kind of statistically significant difference with you as the group we were focusing on. And we were very pleased to know that between the winter of 2018 and the winter of 2020 on both of these instruments and on all 6 together, there was a very strong, statistically significant positive difference between the cohort A schools and the cohort B schools. So what that means is that we have evidence that the work you were doing with your facilitators and the Hill process was actually changing in a positive direction the conditions in your school for shared leadership and shared responsibility for student learning, and for some very specific behaviors that support student learning, and some very specific conditions in your school that support student learning. The other thing we learned from our external evaluators is that even though we couldn't test your school's ELA results in 2020, spring of 2020, already by spring of 2019, which is only 15 months after we started working with you, cohort A schools made statistically significant gains in student ELA proficiency compared to the cohort B schools. And that's important to you, and it's important to us. We love seeing that even that early in the work you were doing with us, that you were moving the needle on student success, ELA success, at a faster rate, a stronger rate of proficiency growth than the schools in the control group. So lots to celebrate. But now we need to see how this data, how the information really can serve your school individually. And that's what we're going to look at right now. This slide gives you a summary side by side of what the two instruments that produce the greatest amount of information for you, what they actually measure. So I'm going to click on this link here, and when you get the slides, you can do the same thing. And the link, whoops. The link will take you to this document that's coming up on the screen right now. What this document does is take each of the dimensions or characteristics that these instruments measure. Each of the two instruments measures 7 characteristics of your school. And it breaks it down with the bullet statements in blue type. It tells you exactly what that characteristic is focusing on. So if we take a look at coherent curricular programs or distributed empowered leadership. Last meeting, I looked at curricular programs, so I'll pick a different one so that Marie and others who were on the previous one get a new look. But so let's take a look at distributed empowered leadership. Why is that important? Through multiple research studies and multiple meta-analyses of research studies over the last 10 to 20 years, researchers have been able to tease out the leadership conditions and the overall conditions in schools that have a positive relationship with student achievement. And over again, these 7 areas have shown up as really being strong predictors of positive growth in student achievement. So in other words, in schools where there was this distributed and empowered leadership, that condition was present in many of the studies where they saw significant gains in student achievement. So this instrument measures that by breaking it down into 3 different items. One, leadership is spread across the entire school with everyone taking part and playing significant roles. Another is teachers are responsible for and included in providing input on improvement targets and goals. And the third one is teachers work collaboratively on improvement activities, provide feedback to each other, and share responsibility for the success of all students. So this instrument, when you look at your results, it tells you that your school has developed this characteristic in your school to a certain level. And that helps you understand where and how you're using the power of distributed leadership to impact student achievement. I'll pick out one more, data-informed decision-making. So what is this one focusing on? Consistently analyzing student data to set short and long-term goals. And we know with the Hill process that we were really focusing on very specific short-term measurable gains. And so we were, in the Hill process, we're trying to balance how much we use end of year, end of benchmarking assessments with how we use real-time data in the course of day-to-day instruction to both set goals for student growth, but also to monitor the progress towards those goals. Another item here is collaborative inquiry across grade levels with multiple sources of grade-specific and school-wide data. And this relates to our school performance profile, where before getting specific about a target for improvement, you're looking at multiple sources of data. You're looking at data that's both what we call post hoc or lagging indicators, and you're looking at real-time data so that you can get down to very specific understanding of what's going on with student learning and what's going on in the conditions in your classrooms, in your school to support student learning. That also includes the use of instructional rounds, observational data, walkthroughs, and those kinds of sources of data. It includes the use of data like what these instruments measure. And then the last item here says administrative support, technology, professional development for inquiry, and data-informed decision-making. And since so much of the time that the facilitator spent with you and your school teams, you've had a lot of support for looking at data. And so this looks at the degree to which you're actually using that support. You're using whatever technology is available to you, and you're creating learning experiences for your staff to look at data and understand and interpret it. So an example of that is what you're doing today. So that's the first instrument. Then on this same document, you will see the second instrument. And many of the items are going to sound very similar to the items in the first instrument. But I like how this instrument is almost a recap or a summary of the work you were doing as you were going through the Hill process. Because you were focusing, you were starting out in the first phase of the process by being clear about what your focus was all about on student literacy. You were carefully monitoring the success of students and really aggressively looking at achievement gaps. And again, it's the drilling into the data and getting down to real-time data that really makes this, this actually produce results. Setting high expectations for all students, not letting yourselves off the hook when you have big achievement gaps. Making sure that we see students through the lens of appreciation for who they are and understand them through their strengths. Having collective ownership and commitment to a vision for all students being successful, and not letting ourselves off the hook because we make it okay for some students to be categorized in a way that we make it okay for them not to be successful. So that's these two instruments. And when you look at your own data, if you look at where you fall, both compared to between the two survey times in 2018 and 2020, and you say, well, we grew here, but we didn't grow here, you can take a look at those areas and go into these statements in blue and say, well, what is it that we were doing that made us grow? What is it that we could do going forward to make us grow? And that's how this particular document will help you. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint now. And what you see on this next slide is a summary of what we just looked at. So over here on the left are 7 conditions within a school that are strongly correlated to positive student outcomes. When the school has a robust process of data-informed decision-making, that they create a safe and orderly place for children to learn, when there's really high expectations for all students and they're cohesive and they're culturally relevant, when the leadership is distributed and empowers teachers to share responsibility and decision making, when the curriculum programs are coherent, they're well aligned vertically and horizontally, and all teachers are teaching around the same curricular outcomes, when there's real-time and embedded instructional assessment that produces day-to-day, week-to-week data that helps teachers understand where students are and plan their instruction, and when there's a sustained commitment and passion for school renewal. When these conditions are positive in a school, they are strongly predictive of growth in student success. So how do you get these conditions? Well, over here on the right, in the blue are the items that the other instrument measures. And it basically says, what are we doing to get those conditions? Well, what we're doing is what we talked about a minute ago. We're focusing on students and their achievement. We're not letting things getting us distracted from very specific focus areas. If it's a literacy focus area, then all hands on deck. All roads lead to better improvement of literacy. That we are using a continuous growth and improvement process. And of course, that's what the Hill School Renewal process is, a continuous growth and improvement or renewal process. That we're balancing internal and external influences. And one example of that is that your external influence in this project has been the essential literacy practices from GELN. But when you implement those, when you've picked certain essential practices to implement, you've created the gold standard implementation guides in which you unpack that practice, figure out its critical features, and identify fidelity behaviors for teachers. That's the external influence. But you also then spend time figuring out letting your teachers figure out how to use the resources in your school to implement those gold standard behaviors in a way that fits their classrooms, fits the way they work, fits the way the school functions, but most importantly, fits what they understand about their students and how their students learn. That's the internal influence. So that's a really important balance, and we call that the balance between fidelity and integrity. The other thing this instrument measures is, are you having really rich, informed data dialogues? And out of those dialogues, are you making week-to-week, month-to-month decisions that help you watch your progress as you're moving forward, make decisions, correct those decisions when you're not getting the progress you want, and keep an evaluation feedback loop going so that you can continually update your efforts. Are you implementing things with integrity so that you can sustain them? Implementing with integrity means you're figuring out how to implement, whether it's MTSS or a program like Leader in Me or the Literacy Essentials, that you're taking the time to figure out what is that going to look like in our school. And are the people who have to implement active developers of those integrity adaptations? Or are they just being handed a playbook from which they're supposed to function like robots? And then is there a lot of internal efficacy and ownership and shared responsibility that creates a really highly professional environment and culture in your school? So that's what these two instruments measure. Pretty exciting stuff to have two instruments that give you that much information. I hope this inspires you to reach out to us if you want to continue following your growth in these two areas. We would recommend that you might look at an every other year cycle. So you assessed in 2018, you assessed in 2020, You might assess again on the even years just to watch your trend lines and how you're growing. And even if your data places you at a high end of performance on these criteria, it's still important to keep monitoring how you're either sustaining that or growing that, because what we know is what we monitor, we pay attention to. What we commit to continuing to measure is what we commit to continuing to do. So these instruments could help you avoid spending all this time with us with the HIL process and then drifting away from it once we're done being formal HIL project. So HIL is not, is only a project to the degree that we had some funding to do this work together, but it's really a set of leadership behaviors and conditions and processes that you can sustain forever. And we hope that you'll have some motivation to do that. So when you get the data, there's a couple of important cautions I would give you. One of the patterns that we've had in schools with data is jumping to conclusions too quickly when we look at a piece of data. We often think that the smart thing to do with data is to make declarative statements and say, this piece of data says we're either good or we're bad at something. And I'm going to suggest to you that that's not what this data is all about. As a matter of fact, data on student learning, data on conditions in your school, data on student social emotional development, all of that data, if you can get away from looking at data and making statements that are about good and bad and move more towards really asking questions about what the data tells us that is actionable. Data is only useful to the degree that it's actionable. Most of what we've done with data has been to make judgments, and in many cases, those judgments are wrong, and they can be very harmful. They can cause us to see students and our school and ourselves through a deficit lens. And what we know is that when we start doing that, we go down into a dark hole out of which it's pretty hard to climb in order to do the good work to keep growing. So asking questions like you see on the screen can help you avoid making declarative statements that are incomplete understandings of what the data really means. So you can start out at the 12 o'clock position here, you can start out by saying, what do we actually see in the data? And if you administer the same instrument over time, you can say, what do we see not only in this particular administration of the instrument, but over time, what do we see? What are our patterns been? What are our trends? What have they been? We can say, are there areas that seem to suggest some strengths? Are there areas that seem to point out potential areas for growth? And then beyond that, what does the data really mean? And that's why I gave you the companion document, so that you can take the items that these two surveys measure, and you can go back to taking a look at what they measure, so you can make some conversation that really helps you understand what that data point means. And then the most powerful thing you can do with data is to begin asking questions. When we make statements about what the data says, it's almost like walking away from the data before the data has a chance to really do something for us that's actionable. But when we go on and we ask questions, those questions can lead us to where do we go from here and how should we go from here. So the questions you raise are, I would say, probably even more important than the statements that you feel you can make when you try to interpret the meaning of the data. So spending time asking, what questions does this data raise? Most of the time, no source of data, no one instrument is going to give you the complete picture of any given area that you're trying to assess. That's why we gave you a battery of 3 instruments for teachers and 3 instruments for principals. And the most important instruments are the 2 that we're working with today and in the report that you're going to get. But the other thing is that no data source, even if you have multiple instruments, should be understood without looking at other data that it has relationship to. So if we're looking at data about the leadership conditions in our school, we also want to look at data from perhaps our instructional rounds and our walkthroughs to say, well, the surveys created this picture of what our work looks like, and our walkthroughs and our school renewal and instructional rounds create this picture of what we look like. And then when we lay out our student data, it creates this picture of what we look like. Then when we start asking questions about what are the connections between all these different sources of data, that's when we really start learning what's going on, how it's happening, and why it's happening in our schools. So making those, what Victoria Bernhardt wrote about, she would call it data connections. Those data intersections are really important. After you ask the important questions, then you need to talk about how can we answer those questions. And sometimes you can answer the questions by going back to the data. Sometimes you can answer the questions by looking at the connection between data from one source and the data from another source. Sometimes you have to say, we don't have enough information to answer these questions, but as we go into the next cycle of our renewal work, we'll be sure to then figure out how we can begin to collect data that will answer those questions if they're important. So that's what the purple box reminds us, is that we have to talk about why is it important to answer certain questions. If certain questions need to be answered before we go forward, then you want to make those a priority to get answered. If they're nice to know questions, maybe you don't take the time. You just say, well, it's a piece that we don't understand yet. So prioritizing the kinds of questions that you need to have answered in order to be able to move forward and take action is really your next step. And then you can move into where and how have we found growth edges in this conversation, and how are we going to prioritize which growth edges we're going to pursue, and why would we make those a priority. So I hope this little picture here can be one that you can use with your school team to really have that kind of in-depth conversation. It's probably not a good idea to really bring forth a good piece of data like you're going to see in the survey results from these 2 instruments, if you're not going to give yourself or the team that's looking at the data enough time to really, we call it cuddling with the data, to really spend the time to go through a complete inquiry process. And hearing different people's voices in the inquiry process can make sure that you don't shut down your inquiry too soon, that you look at the data from multiple perspectives, and that the data really starts producing understanding for you that is meaningful and will guide you on how to move forward. None of this is about making judgment. I'm going to say that probably 3 or 4 different ways, 3 or 4 different times. These are not data sources that should be used for making judgments. It's about understanding your current state so that you know what the next moves are towards your desired state. And the more we have these really good data inquiry conversations, the better we're going to get at setting priorities for what we focus on to move forward. So let's take a look at an example of this data. So what you're looking at here is not yours. It's not Kevin, it's not yours. And it's not yours, Yamaka, because your data is private. I'm not going to put that on a screen. But this is a sample of what a data report looks like. Your report will be structured just like this. So this is the instrument called Learning-Centered Leadership Outcomes. And the first factor, or the first piece of data you're going to see is what we call the overall result. So it's the entire survey. Then you're going to see for that overall result, you're going to see two bars. And they're going to be kind of broken up with some individual dots at each end. These bars show you the distribution of the results. The bottom bar for overall is here, where my arrow is. The bottom bar is 2018, when you started the Hill Project. The top bar is 2020, this last winter. If you are the school that this data display represents, you can see with the red dot where your school results compared to everybody else's in the cohort of 75 schools. So this lower bar here shows the distribution of the results for all 75 schools. Where the bar looks like it's breaking up into separate dots, you have fewer schools at that level. Where it shows that it's almost a solid line, that's where a large proportion of the schools are clustering. The longer the space between one end and the other of where you see the darker continuous line, the more spread out those schools are that are clustering together. The longer from top to bottom, the more spread out the results were. So in this particular case, you can see that the red dot is the dot that shows where this particular school fell. And what the red dot says is when they first took the survey, they were a little above the curve, a little to the positive side on the curve of where all schools fell, but they were still in that sort of central area where all schools fell. We call that the inner quartiles. Then when they took it in 2020, they were still within the cluster of where a good portion of the schools scored, but that whole cluster had moved up. And they had moved up with that cluster. So I'm going to stop there and see if you have any questions. And I'm going to check the chat. You're welcome as I go. If you'd like to put a question in the chat, I'm bringing the chat up on my screen, but I'm not sure if you can see it too. Janice, can they see the chat if I open it? Okay. So I'm going to pause for a minute and just see Kevin and Yamaka. Do you have any questions right now before I continue on?
No, I don't at this time.
Okay, if you do, go ahead and write it in the chat, or because we're just a few of us on, you can even interrupt me. Don't worry about it.
Well, I guess I do have a small question.
Okay.
So you know how the lines are set up and you said the red dot indicates where we are across all 75?
Yep.
So when I'm looking at under overall, the second line, which would have been 2018, correct?
Yes.
Um, when I look at that line, is that red dot closer to, like, is there like 0 to 100? Like, how exactly do I read that? Or am I missing it?
Okay, so what this display doesn't show you is what the actual position is relative to the maximum score or the minimum score you could have had on the instrument. That doesn't show you that.
So that red dot, what I look at it and say, because it looks like I'm lower rather than middle or high, or is that middle? Or am I missing how to interpret it, period?
So this is always compared to the group that you took the assessment with. So
Right.
every one of these dots is somebody, one of the 75 schools. So if you were this school, when we took the assessment first, you were scoring near the average. You were scoring near the peak of the bell curve, if you will.
Okay.
But you were to the positive side of the average. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay.
So Pat, I would say it would be high average.
Yes.
But
But what
that red dot in particular would be a high average.
yeah,
Correct.
for that group, okay? And then what it shows you is that the whole group moved up, which is why our external evaluators said we had statistically significant positive change, because this whole group moved up, and they moved up in a significantly
Yeah.
way than the cohort B schools did.
Okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. But then you can also see that if this was your school moved up, the whole group moved up, your school moved up with the group, but now you see where you are with where a lot of them clustered together. You're still at the positive end of the group that all clustered together in their performance. Does that make sense? Now, this particular display shows a couple of things. As you go farther into it, then you can see item by item what the change was. Was it a positive change? Was it a negative change? Was it hardly any change? What did the change look like? And how did your change compare to the change of everybody else in the cohort? So you can see that here, the size of the jump between the two red dots, you can kind of watch how that changes. Got a little bit smaller here, but look how the size of the jump here. So this school on safe and orderly school operations made a big jump and went from close to the middle of the pack to at the leading edge of the group. Whereas on, let's look at distributed and empowered leadership, look at the big jump that they made on this one. You see the difference there? And what they know is that they were a little bit under what would be the midpoint of where everybody was clustering to start out with, but they really took a big jump up along with the whole group, but the group is actually a little more spread out on this. So this there wasn't as tight a cluster the second time they took this assessment. So watching the density of these bars helps you understand how the whole group grew as well. So this is the instrument of those 7 school conditions that are strongly correlated to student success. Let's look at the other instrument. And what you're going to see is a similar profile for the same school. But remember, these this is measuring more the leadership behaviors that led to the change in those conditions we looked at on the first instrument. So it's kind of nice to see how what you're doing to change yourselves in these behaviors relates to how you're actually changing those conditions of the 7 dimensions of learning-centered leadership. And so that's putting these two side by side when you look at them with your team is a really good strategy. Again, this school made positive movement, sometimes more in some areas and sometimes less in other areas. So you can see where you just don't want to start making statements about, and we did, you know, so the statements about, oh, we did good here or we did badly here, don't fit in this conversation. The only thing that fits in this conversation is, how did we change? Where did, you know, what's the pattern of change? How does how we changed in one area relate to how we changed in another area? And how do we understand why and how we made that change? And what does that change mean? Or what's the possibility for how that change might be influencing the overall success of our school and our students? Different conversation, isn't it? And it takes a while to practice having the conversation. You know, you're going to find when you look at this data or any data with your school staff, we're so encultured to look for, you know, we look for our weaknesses. I think through the Hill process, we've learned more to look for our strengths and try to look for our strengths first. But I think this conversation will let you even go beyond that, to look not only for strengths and growth edges, but to go deeper and say, how did we get here? What is our pathway of growth? If we keep growing the way we are growing, where is this headed? And how, you know, how will the pathway and the rate at which we're growing help us achieve our goals for students? And it all comes down to setting priorities for how we decide to, what we decide to make a focus for the next cycle of growth. Let me bring up the other school for a minute. This is the second school example. This school I picked out because this school didn't start out as strong as the first school did. It was falling lower in the bands on compared to other schools in the first assessment. But then look what happened in 2020. So not only did they make these big levels of growth, but in several areas, they went from being a school that was at the lower end of the distribution to a school that was at the higher end. Not on all items, but on several. And they did the same. This one is absolutely stark. And I would say that one of the things you can think about with this instrument called the Orientation for School Renewal, some instruments are stronger leading indicators. Indicators of, they're more sensitive to efforts that you're making over a shorter period of time to grow. And this instrument is definitely sensitive, more sensitive to what you're doing in real time to change the way you function as a school, because it's focused on behaviors that you're actually implementing. And so an instrument like this, if you're making this kind of change, you can think about this as a good predictor, a leading indicator that other measures, especially measures in student achievement, might not have these big gains yet, but if you keep focusing on these areas, because these areas are all correlated to positive growth in student achievement, if you've already made this much growth, then what this tells you is stay the course. Don't abandon these behaviors, because eventually you're going to start seeing a greater and greater payoff in the measures that are more lagging indicators, that they're harder to move. I'm going to stop and see if that raises any questions. But the thing I think that I like about this particular illustration is that it helps point out how important it is to have a good balance as you're looking at how your school uses data. It's really important to have a good balance between what we call leading indicators and lagging indicators. The other way we've talked about it is real-time data versus post hoc data or end of year data or ex post facto data, however you want to call it. But this instrument tends to be a really good leading indicator.
So the questions remain the same regardless of the outcome or the data. You still kind of focus on the same questions that gear conversation to what
Yes.
happens, right? Regardless of anything. That's what you want to focus on.
Yes.
Okay.
So our old way of thinking, if we were this school, our old way of thinking, if we saw this data report, might be to say, well, look at us. Aren't we wonderful? We got ourselves all the way to the top of the performance spread on this. So, gosh, we're done with this. We've achieved a high, we've made ourselves good. We're done. That would be a huge mistake. That's a dangerous way to use data that shows growth. If you have data that shows this kind of growth, that's not an indicator that you're done. It's an indicator that you were working on the right stuff in the right way. And you want to make sure that as you go forward, you don't abandon that. You want to keep focusing on it, especially if you saw growth in student outcomes at the same time, or you saw growth in other indicators that are good predictors of student outcomes.
Okay, so celebration is fine, but the digging deep of how we got there is what's most important.
Yep. Mm-hmm. There's a Doug Reeves had a publication with Brian McNulty where they talked about data tells you what to keep doing, what to do more of, what to sustain. And that's how I hope you'll look at this data. What is it that we're doing that we can say is the right work? How are we doing at making the right work consistent and pervasive in our school? Because becoming a school that can do all the right work all the time without having to without having that work compete with other things, who can stay focused on that and embed that so it becomes part of your day-to-day routines, those are the schools that become high reliability schools. And if you've read any of the literature from Waters and group and Hattie's group on high reliability schools are schools that would look at this data and say, those are the things we've got to keep doing. And we're going to keep monitoring it. Even if we topped out of the instrument, we're going to keep monitoring it to be sure we don't get distracted and stop doing the right things consistently. I think you both have submitted something, a request to receive your data. Have you both done that, Kevin and Yamaka?
Yeah, and I have it already.
Okay, good.
Wait, what exactly did you ask me? I'm sorry.
Did you submit a request to get a copy of your data?
I don't think I did, no.
Okay, well, this link right here on this slide, the top link there on the slide, will allow you to submit the link to get your data. And if you have any problem at all completing that and submitting it, all you have to do is email Elizabeth Schaefer and she'll help you. And her email is on here.
Okay, so the bit.ly is the one I need to click on?
Yep. Mm-hmm. And
Okay.
it will get you to the form to request your data.
I put it in the chat too.
Thanks,
Dr. Reese.
Jeremy. You're
No
awesome.
problem.
Yeah.
No problem.
Thank you. Now, if you want your facilitator to get a copy of the data, then what you need to do is email Elizabeth Schaefer and just say, please provide a copy of my data to my facilitator and name their name. Then she would contact the facilitator and she'll have a form, a non-disclosure form that they'll sign before we give it to her or him, if you have a male facilitator, in which they will verify that they'll only use the data in a way that you and they agree to help your school use it. So to, you know, the data will only be used by your facilitator with you and with your permission and your direction on how to use it. And when they're all done working with you with that piece of data, then they'll destroy it. But that's your choice. You don't have to give permission for your facilitator to have a copy of the data. If you do, then you want to make that person a partner in whatever data dialogues you're going to have about the data, so that they can help. And that's why they're all sitting in on these conversations. By the time Marie's done, she will have heard this presentation probably 4 times, so that she wants to get better and better at being your partner, as does Jeremy and Janice, to be able to help you have these dialogues with your team.
Hey, Jeremy, can you put Elizabeth's email in the chat so I can just copy it?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Appreciate you, sir.
He's a good guy to have around, isn't he?
Yeah, amazing. So do I just put today's for the date of request, today's date?
Yep.
All right.
Okay. So, and I want to remind you that this slide deck, you can use it too. This slide deck where you've got, that's what the bit.ly link at the beginning provided for you was the slide deck. And then this link goes back to the breakdown of what each of those instruments measures. So all you have to do is just click on the links and you will be able to you can download the slides to your own computer. If you download out of Google, you can download them as PowerPoint slides if you want. And you can use them any way you want to work with your teams. They're our gift to you. If you do, you probably want to replace the slides with the example data with your own data. So there's a couple of things I wanted to talk to you about in terms of what ifs. And because there's 75 of you, I don't remember specifically what Kevin and yours and Yamaka's data looks like. But within the whole pool of 70-some schools, there were a couple of cases where overall change wasn't positive for a couple schools. And there's all kinds of reasons why that might be. And then there were a couple schools where some items had a positive change, some didn't change at all, and some had a negative change. And again, I want to caution you against jumping into conclusions. So for instance, if you have a school whose change didn't look as positive as the ones we just looked at together, and something happened, like maybe there was a change in principle or whatever, be careful you don't jump to assumptions about cause and effect. In other words, if you're a school that had one profile in 2018 and in 2020 the profile didn't look nearly as strong, that it looked like it got weaker, be careful that you don't say, well, gosh, it must be that there was something that went wrong when we changed principles. It may or may not have anything to do with a change in principle. Sometimes there can be a negative change or a neutral change in an item on an instrument like this because the second time around, people have experienced something, and your staff has definitely experienced the Hill process. They've experienced something that makes them a little bit more discerning, that makes them maybe even understand the survey items better. And so they might be a little bit more authentic, or even a little bit more critical when they're assessing the current state. So again, just be careful that you don't jump to the conclusions about cause and effect or good or bad. Even if there's a decline, you still want to ask the same questions. Where did we decline? How did we decline? How do we understand that compared to other evidence of change in our school? What else was going on? And how can we understand that decline? In most cases, the profiles were pretty consistent. There's so much strong predictive relationship between the 7 items on each of these measures that they tend to predict each other to a high degree. And so if you changed in one direction on one item, you tend to change in that direction on another. So there's generally a pattern of either small or larger change in one direction or another that's pretty consistent across the instrument. But in some cases, it was a little uneven. So if it was a little uneven, where some things had positive, some things had negative, some things had big change positive or tiny change or neutral, again, that's something you want to focus on and say, well, how did that happen? Does it make sense with what we know about how we lived our work in the school for the last 2 years? So, and there are a lot of cases I mentioned earlier this morning. One of the things that Marzano, Waters, and McNulty found when they did a meta-analysis of studies that looked for leadership conditions in schools that had made great student gains is that they found these 21 characteristics that you could boil down to any of these 7 that you see on these instruments. But they also found that when schools were dealing with major second order change, when they were really trying to make some big change in student outcomes, that some of those positive factors went down while others went up. And it was because the school needed the factors that went up more at that time to make positive growth than they needed the others. So don't get panicky if you see an item go down while other items went up. there could be a very good reason that it did that. It could be that it shows that you focused on a priority area and for a while didn't focus on another area that's important, but not as important as the area you focused on.
Well, and this is all about, to me, how can this survey inform our work? And that's the way we should take it. How can we inform our work? How can it help us be better at certain areas than others? And what about, how can we get more focused on what we need to do? I mean, those are the big macro level questions.
Yep. And unfortunately, because of the accountability movement, those kinds of questions have been kind of pushed aside because of policies that require us to put labels on schools and educators and kids. So this is a chance for us to kind of flip things around and spend 99% of our time talking about what Janice just said and reserve judgment for less than 1% of what we do with data. So to conclude, we hope that you're going to see enough motivation in this data that it will help you think about how you're going to move forward in continuing the Hill process. I'd like to encourage you to not think of Hill as being like a project that has a beginning and an ending. Hill stands for high impact leadership. There will never be a time when your school doesn't need high impact leadership. High impact leadership is leadership shared by the whole entire school, not vested in just the principal. And while the principal plays a critical role in establishing high impact leadership across the school, this is not about whether you've got a good or bad principal. It's about whether your school is growing, constantly growing and sustaining the leadership conditions that will actually result in better success for kids. So we hope that that's how you'll think about Hill. Yes, you're not going to have your facilitator with you, but we are going to be publishing for you communications that will tell you in very specific ways that we can continue to support you as you try to continue to sustain this work. The first way is to participate in the summit coming up in a week and a half, because you'll have an opportunity to work on how you can use the Hill practices, leadership practices, to just really be ready for this school year and all of the contingencies that you're trying to figure out for this school year. So keep in mind that these Hill leadership practices and principles are not just about literacy. They're about a school having the capacity and the motivation to address growth, continuous growth in student success, no matter what the conditions are. So we hope you will continue to stay focused on the work and let us help you sustain it. We're waiting for final word on our funding from the Department of Ed, and then we will be able to put out some more specifics about what we can do for you during this year. And at the end of the summit, we'll be collecting more feedback from you to give us ideas about ways, if we can't send a facilitator into your school like we have been.